We now continue our adventures with George Berkeley and his empirical reformation. We now turn to his look at primary and secondary quality arguments. As we saw in the previous video, Berkeley goes through some fairly stock arguments, trying to establish that secondary qualities are not out there in the world, something that people like John Locke and other similar philosophers would certainly agree to. So what Berkeley has to do is show that the primary qualities, which philosophers like John Locke claim are out there in the world, he has to show that they exist in the mind and not out in the world, because there is no out in the world in the sense of there being material objects, for Berkeley at least. So the primary qualities are claimed by thinkers like John Locke to be qualities that exist in these material objects that are, for people who are dualist or materialist, that exist apart from the mind. And they include examples such as extension, which is being extended in 3 dimensions, figure, basically shape, motion, rest, solidity, impenetrability, number, and like qualities. The secondary qualities are qualities that exist in the mind and are supposedly created by qualities in the objects that they do not resemble. And matter, for people who believe in it, at least in this context, would be an inert, senseless substance in which extension, figure, motion, and the other primary qualities subsist. So Berkeley has to do, as he claims there is no matter in the metaphysical sense, and so there's no primary qualities out there in matter because there is no matter out there. But these primary qualities do still seem to exist, so he has to argue that they're in the mind. And this is very critical to his argument. So, let's see how he does it. One argument he begins with is the contradiction argument from the Treaties. He asserts, as a premise, that extension, figure, and motion are only ideas existing in the mind, or so he claims. He's argued before that an idea can only be like another idea, so neither they nor their archetypes can exist in an unperceiving substance. So the notion of matter, he claims, involves a contradiction. So the gist of this argument is that these qualities are only ideas existing in the mind, and ideas can only be like other ideas, and so they can't exist in unperceiving substances because they have to exist in the mind, and matter is unperceiving. So the notion of matter having these qualities, he claims, is a contradiction, because it would involve saying that something that does not perceive has ideas that require a perceiving mind, but that, of course, according to Berkeley, is impossible, or rather inconceivable, or so he claims. His next argument is the Inseparability Argument, which occurs both in the Treaties and the dialogue. So here's how the argument goes. People who claim that primary qualities exist in matter, such as John Locke, Descartes, and other dead philosophers, and some living ones as well, they claim that secondary qualities are mental sensations, which are dependent on the texture and motion of particles of matter. So the secondary qualities arise from the primary qualities. Now, if we take primary qualities to be inseparably united with secondary qualities, and they cannot be abstracted from them, then they must exist, at least according to Berkeley, only in the mind. Now, we saw back earlier that Berkeley believes that he has defeated abstract ideas. So his view is we can't do this abstraction. So his take is that we cannot, by abstraction, conceive the extension and motion of a body without all other sensible qualities. So we can't split them off. Why I think this? Well, he says that we can't conceive of a body without a color or other sensible quality, which is supposed to exist only in the mind. It is inconceivable for us to be able to conceive of a body that doesn't have a color or other sensible quality, or so he claims. And so these qualities of extension, figure, and motion, if we try to abstract them from all their qualities, he claims that they are inconceivable. So these qualities must exist with all their sensible qualities only in the mind. So the gist of it is that he's, noting that people who claim that there are primary qualities say they're out there for real, and the primary qualities are united with the secondary qualities, because when we experience an object, we experience like the color, shape, etc. And Berkeley says we can't abstract out the primary qualities from the secondary qualities. He claims we can't do this. And he infers that since we can't do this, or so he claims, that since you can't separate the primary and secondary qualities, they can't be separated. So if the secondary qualities are in the mind, like all his primary critics or opponents like Locke, etc., agree, then the secondary qualities must have with them the primary qualities. So there's really no primary-secondary quality distinction for real. They're all in the mind, according to him at least. And he keeps on arguing for this. Now he does consider an objection against this. And again, when arguing philosophically, you need to argue for your position, and you have to consider reasonable and fair objections, and not just dismiss them out of hand. They have to be given due time. So here's a potential objection from the dialogue. Now there are some who claim the existence of extension in general and motion in general. So, according to Berkeley, the notion of extended, movable substance depends on abstract ideas, or so he claims. Berkeley believes he's already handled this, because, again, going back to the past, he has argued that abstract ideas can't be. So if there are no abstract ideas, and in order to get this notion of, extension and motion in general requires abstract ideas, and there's none of them, you can't do that. He also notes that this view resembles the view attributed to Aristotle of materia prima, prime matter. And Berkeley seems to be relying here on the fact that much of modern philosophy was a reaction against our good dead friend Aristotle. You get this sort of move against him. But he is right to note that prime matter is problematic and mysterious, as we'll see, in various forms in the future. So he considers that objection, but in a way he's already beaten the objection because it rests on, as he sees it, abstract ideas, but he believes he's already disproven those, so he thinks the objection fails. Now what about number? Because that's supposed to be a primary quality. He addresses this in the Treaties, and he claims the number is obviously relative and dependent on understanding. How so? Well, here's his reasoning. Think of a book, a physical book. So you'd have one book, but also within the book you could have one page. And on the page you could have one line. And these are all equal units. One book, one page, one line. Although obviously some contain several of the others. A book contains many pages, pages tend to contain many lines. And you can keep this going. A line contains, many words. Word contain, the line contains a word, the word contains a letter, etc. And what he asserts is that the unit relates to a particular combination of ideas arbitrarily put together by the mind. So he infers, perhaps incorrectly, that number exists in the mind. And this is one of those arguments that you look at and you say, well, it seems kind of clever, but does it actually work? Does the fact that we sort of arbitrarily designate, one book, one page, one line, one word, one letter, does that indicate that number just exists in the mind? And this debate about where numbers are, whether they're real or not, whether they exist in the mind or not, again goes way back to our good dead friend Pythagoras. But Berkeley thinks to his satisfaction he has shown that number exists just in the mind. So no numbers out there. Interestingly enough, he brings up a dream argument. And this is interesting because in epistemology, the dream argument is used typically by skeptics who say, how do you know what you seem to be experiencing is really real for real? This could all be but a dream. So how do you know? Descartes, of course, famously used the dream argument in his Meditations on First Philosophy, but his goal was to bring up skepticism to try to find something that he could not doubt, to build a foundation. So Berkeley does an interesting thing with the dream argument. Again, normally the dream argument is used to argue against the claim we have knowledge, to try to establish that we don't seem to know. So Berkeley points out this. Even people who claim that there's matter, they must admit that people could have all the ideas they do without there being matter. Why? Well, dreams, and what he calls frenzies, proves this. And it's a pretty good argument because unless we think that when we're dreaming, we're in some kind of dream world, which is not an idea that has not been presented. There are views in which dreaming is a real, thing. Not that dreaming is a real thing, but the dream world is a real world. And so if we can have all our dreams, unless we want to claim that there is a dream reality, a material dream reality, a dreamlands, then we would have to seemingly accept this, that we can dream without an actual material dream world. Therefore, it would seem that we could have all the ideas we do without a material. But what about distance? In the dialogue, Berkeley takes up this question, because the external world, the material world, is supposed to be three-dimensional. So perception of distance is a means of identifying extension, that we seem to perceive that things are far away or close. The character of Philoneus, or Philonous, argues that because we perceive distance in dreams, there is no need to accept the existence of real extension, which is actually a pretty good argument, because he seems to be right. When we dream as if we're in three-dimensional space, and it feels three-dimensional. But unless we believe in a separate dream reality, we'd have to accept that there's no matter behind this, that all these dreams are just ideas. So this is actually, a pretty good argument. Now, again, the way to counter it would be there are a couple ways. One is to argue that there is a dream world that we visit when we're asleep. Another way to counter is to argue that we would still need, experiences of three-dimensionality to have these dreams about it. So there are ways around it. Now, he also argues that when an object appears distant to us, we're not really experiencing distance. What we experience is an object that appears small. And he's argued previously that size is relative to the perceiver, that the supposed primary qualities are relative. And so distance, if it's a matter of, perceived size, would also be relative to the perceiver as well. And so this is also an interesting argument. I mean, if you're familiar with certain optical illusions, and also just, drawing, painting, etc., art, or with computer monitors, if you've ever played, 3D, games, the idea like first-person shooters, your monitor is, obviously it's got some depth to it, but the screen itself effectively is, effectively two-dimensional, but it looks like there's distance. And the way it's created is by, making objects, smaller relative to you. And if you're familiar with the ways of doing perspective when drawing, you create the appearance of distance by, making objects appear smaller or larger. And so there's some plausibility here. Now, Philoneus also argues that a person who is born blind and then gains sight would not interpret visual images as presenting the quality of distance. And Berkeley actually seems to be right here. There have been studies conducted where people who were born blind have been surgically, medically granted their sight, and they do have to figure this stuff out. There's, interest. It's good that they've assisted these people, but they also provide interesting information about how perception works. So Polonius argues that the person would have to learn to associate the visual images with a concept of distance, which seems to be true. Now, the fact that he get that right doesn't necessarily prove that his philosophical claims about, there's no space, no dimensionality, and that it's all in the mind is true, but he seems to be right about that particular point about perception. Next is his imagination argument, which occurs both in the treaties and dialogues. And this is, kind of his clever, but also kind of flawed argument. And here's how it goes. So the characters of Polonius, or Philonous, is talking to Hylas. And again, Philo is Berkeley's spokesperson. And we know this because Philo, wins. And Hylas is the opposition, and we know that because Hylas, loses. So Philo says to Hylas the following. He says, Hylas, if you can conceive of any sensible object existing apart from the mind, then he will concede to Hylas and say there's matter. And so Hylas says, there's nothing easier to conceive than a tree or house existing by itself, independent of and unperceived by any mind. So take, for example, the picture of the tree house there. And you just kind of imagine in your mind the tree house there, or just look at the picture, and imagine, there's nobody there. So you're conceiving of a tree and a tree house, existing by itself without there being someone there perceiving it. So does that defeat Berkeley? Well, Berkeley's character Philo, laughs and says, aha, this is just having ideas while omitting the idea of anyone to perceive them. And here's his, killer move, his fatality. He says, you perceive or think of them all the while. Because Hylas cannot claim, without contradiction, that the conception of the tree or house is present in his mind at the same time it is not present in a mind. So this is extremely clever. So the challenge is, again, if Hylas can conceive of any sensible object existing apart from the mind, then Berkeley will give up. And so Hylas' response is essentially to conceive of a tree or a house existing by itself, like this tree house here, and then not, imagining anyone there perceiving it. But Berkeley's response is, of course, that when you're thinking of this, you're thinking of the tree or the house or the tree house, you are thinking of them. So, in a way, he's right that you cannot think of something without thinking of it. And what essentially his challenge is, if you can think of something without thinking of it, then you win. But of course you can't do that. So why is this only clever, not decisive? Well, there's different ways to look at conceiving. So yes, I can't think of a treehouse without thinking of a treehouse, but it would seem that I could conceive of a treehouse existing unperceived by any mind. That's to say that I'm essentially thinking of the idea of that occurring. But then Berkeley would, of course, say, well, you can't do that. It's still a contradiction. So that's kind of an interesting battle about that. And it's one of his classic replies here. Now, kind of the main foe of Berkeley is a view held by thinkers like our good dead friend John Locke, which is a representational realism. And representational realism is pretty broadly accepted. And some version of it is still very popular today. And here's the idea. Ideas exist in your mind. And some of these ideas resemble objects that are out there. They represent them. and objects are real, hence representational realism. And again, it's kind of the view that, it's pretty much standard in science. If you take a class, doing science stuff about the brain, they talk about perception. They'll talk about things occurring in the brain that are stimulated by objects out in the world, and the particular mechanics of it and the metaphysics of it have changed over the centuries, but the basic idea still remains. So the following objection can be raised. Think of a portrait, a picture. All that is seen in a picture is color and shapes. For the picture to suggest the idea of an actual person, we must have an experience that associates the two. Another example, you could be said to hear a coach, a carriage, carrying people, but you just hear its sounds and associate them with the coach based on experiences of hearing and seeing. So we only have a correlation between ideas and experiences and never get beyond the ideas. Hence, we cannot tell if an idea resembles an external object. We can never make the comparison. Now, this is an ancient skeptical argument. If we go way back to the ancient skeptics, they argued the same thing, that you have ideas, in your mind, and you have no way of knowing that what you're experiencing matches what is out there for real, because you can never get out of your own mind. And this goes way back. So there's nothing new in Berkeley here, but he's doing an interesting thing. He's taking the old skeptical argument, and rather than saying, ooh, you can't know if there's anything out there, he's, repurposing it and weaponizing it against there being stuff out there. So his conclusion is not that you can't know if there's stuff out there. His conclusion is there's nothing out there. There's no matter out there, which is rather interesting. So when it comes to the primary and secondary qualities, he asks the question, what would a real object, devoid of all sensible qualities, be? Can a real thing, in itself invisible, be like a color, or a real thing which is not audible be like a sound? In a word, can anything be like a sensation or idea, but another sensation or idea? And this is, a reasonable point. In fact, it becomes it was and still is, kind of a standard argument against there being substrata, something underneath the qualities. Because, the idea would be this. Imagine you take like a apple. We'll take a, Granny Smith apple. They're green. If you were to take away the green, the density, mass, volume, and all the chemical qualities, just take everything away. And what would be left if you took away all the qualities? And the answer would seem to be nothing. There'd be nothing left. If you took away the color, shape, volume, mass, density, etc., you seem to have nothing. And again, this is a stark argument against substrata. And it is a reasonable argument. So he does make a good point. And so he believes that he's defeated representational realism. Now he does consider, an objection against his view. Again, philosophy, the large part is advancing arguments for your view, rationally and reasonably, and then considering fair and reasonable objections against them and replying to them. The idea is to get to the truth. So one objection at this point is the banishing of the real from the treaties. And so, the obvious objection is this. All that is real and substantial in nature is banished and replaced with a chimerical scheme of ideas. And of course, a chimera is a mythological beast which combines the parts of various creatures. So, sort of the classic chimera, would have the head of a dragon, head of a goat, head of a lion body, typically snake tail, wings, and of course the dragon head is mythical too. In science terms, there are chimeras that are creatures that seem to have these weird components to them. And the name comes of course from the mythological chimera. Another objection going along with this is all things that exist only in the mind, so is everything an illusion. So these are pretty good objections. It seems like the real is gone, and all we have is just delusion. Again, the ancient skeptics, that was their argument. How do you know there's anything real for real? Maybe it's all a dream. Ooh, be scared, be very scared. So here's how he replies in the Treaties. He says, don't worry about it. Whatever we see, feel, hear, or otherwise conceive or understand remains as secure and real as ever. There is a rerum natura, basically a real nature, and the distinction between realities and chimeras, he claims, retains full force. He says that he hasn't argued against the existence of anything that we can apprehend by sense or reflection. He doesn't question the existence of what he sees and touches. If you ask Berkeley, are there apples? He'd say, sure, yeah. Is there Australia? And kiwis, the fruit, and the bird, and the New Zealanders. He'd say, yeah, sure, there's all that stuff. Then you might ask, well, what are you denying then? And he'd say, well, I'm only denying the existence of the philosopher's material substance. He would say, I have no doubt about kiwis, the bird, the fruit, the New Zealander. He just says there's none of this weird material substance stuff. And he said this is no big deal, because denying the existence of matter doesn't damage the rest of humanity. They'll never miss it. Then their life doesn't revolve around a commitment to material substance. But he thinks this is actually a good thing to get rid of it, because first, the atheist will lack an empty name to support their impiety. Basically, again, going back, he thinks abstraction is a gateway drug to matter, matter is a gateway to atheism, which of course is presumably a gateway to hell. So he claims that this, basically takes away from the atheists, one of their tools for being atheist. He also believes that he's taken away from the philosophers a great handle for trifling and disputation. So he thinks this is really a good thing, that everything is as we think it is. There are apples and, kiwis and sandwiches and stars and moons and so forth. There's just no material substance, which you don't need, and we just take a dangerous weapon away from the atheists, and we take a toy away from philosophers, or so he claims. So, not a terrible argument. But then he runs into kind of an interesting challenge, because, again, he's weaponizing a skeptical argument to say there's nothing out there. And again, the whole point of the skeptics was to say, ooh, it could all be a dream. It seems like we don't know. How can you prove that we know? Then Berkeley runs into his own problem here, which he raises himself. Again, philosophy, when done properly, is all about considering serious objections and responding to them, considering them honestly. So Hylas, the character written by Berkeley who argues against Berkeley, says this: what difference is there between real things and chimeras formed by the imagination, or the visions of a dream, since they're all equally in the mind? Which is a really good objection, because Berkeley's problem is this, that the normal way to distinguish dreams and reality is to say, well, there's stuff out there that's real, and the stuff that goes on in your head when you're asleep is, dream. And illusions are things that are not, physically real out there. If everything is a mental entity, how do you distinguish between a real apple and your dream apple? Or if you're hallucinating about an apple, how do you distinguish them? Well, Philonous says, kind of stealing from Descartes, that the ideas of a dream are dim, irregular, and confused. Ideas of real things are more vivid and clear. So we distinguish dreams from reality by comparing one experience to another. We obviously cannot make a comparison between experience and an independent reality because, according to Berkeley, there is no such thing. So it's interesting here that he raises the dream problem, which is a problem for him. Again, his problem is not how do you know when you're dreaming and, not experiencing the outside world. His problem is, how do you separate dreams from non-dream ideas, because it's all in the mind. And he essentially uses something Descartes attempted, which is basically that dreams are less vivid and clear, they're irregular and confused, basically like a quality thing. They're like lower quality ideas. And Descartes thought that wasn't enough. That's not enough to do it, because he keeps going into his skepticism. But perhaps Berkeley's in a better place, because he doesn't claim there's anything, there's no matter behind them. He could just say the distinction is, well, if the ideas are all kind of, messed up and not very vivid, you're dreaming. And if they're very vivid and clear, then they're real. But then, of course, a clever person would say, well, what about very lucid dreaming, where it seems, really real? How do you distinguish? And so that's kind of a problem. He then turns to existence from the Treaties. So again, as we saw, so when we say that things exist, kind of, in our sort of popular view today, because of the influence of physics, etc., we would tend to say things like, it exists, that there's matter, material object. But again, his definition is to say that, say, a table exists would be that you see and feel it. And that if you left, the table would exist, would mean that if you were there, you might perceive it, or there's another spirit perceiving it. Now, one of the most famous attacks on Berkeley was from this fellow Samuel Johnson. And Johnson, read Berkeley, and then he, kind of went, and set down the book, went outside, and kicked a stone, saying, "I refute him thus." Now, clever, it's the kind of thing I guess you would see on, like, Twitter today and YouTube. But like many things you see on Twitter and YouTube, the critic totally missed Berkeley's point. Berkeley doesn't say that you wouldn't have an experience of kicking a stone. When Johnson kicks the stone, he experiences solidity, motion, colors, and so on, which would be a series of ideas. And Berkeley would just say back to him, all these sensations can exist without the existence of a physical body. Going outside and kicking a stone doesn't disprove Berkeley's theory, because Berkeley would say, yeah, you can experience all that. He never denies that you can go outside and have the experience of kicking a stone. He just says there's no matter behind the stone. Now, Berkeley is aware that all this seems absurd. For example, going back to the apple example, suppose you're eating an apple. An apple is just a collection of ideas. So are you just eating ideas when you eat an apple? When you're driving, are you driving your ideas along ideas to go to an idea? That all seems weird. Now, he says this way of putting it seems very harsh. But he says this is because of the language we use. We use the word things instead of ideas. He claims that he has no argument with the terms, as long as it accepted that objects are a collection of ideas. And so he says, to think with the learned and speak with the vulgar. And so the gist of his argument is that because of language, presumably because of like the influence of philosophy and science and stuff, we talk in terms of things, and that kind of has behind it, for most people, conceptual idea of matter. And it seems, weird to talk about an apple being ideas. But just like in, any sort of specialized field, the way people like normally talk need not match up with the way things, really are. And are often our sort of popular terminology doesn't get things, quite right. Not to say that it's wrong, but that, it means something, sort of popularly as opposed to in very technical terms. So Berkeley thinks he solved that sort of, weirdness problem. And going back to our methodology, essentially his view is this is a weirdness objection, that, it seems weird to talk this way, and his solution is, well, it's not really that weird if you kind of, fix the language a little bit, or so he claims. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.